Alright, so let's get started. So, where did we stop off last week? I think we stopped at field properties, right? Or the last class?
Yes.
And where is this document? Merchant. Documents on by me. Where is this document? Okay, found it. So we were working on these steps here, steps to create a access database. So we're gonna be finishing off. I think we're gonna be finishing off these steps today. So in review of what we have looked at so far, we looked at the layout of creating a database. Remember, we create the database first. We're talking about computerized database. We're talking about Microsoft Access database. You create that database file, and you create a table, you put in your data, and that is how you get a field, and the row is called a record. We looked at the different objects. We looked at the steps. So when you create a table, after you create the database file, you create a table. You need to design that table. How do you design it? You give it a name. You create field names. You set data types for those field names. You give them some descriptions, and you set their field properties. So, right, I think I now remember where we left off. We're supposed to look at this table here on field properties, and well, we can look at that first, and then we'll go on to primary key. So quick question, is the field properties for data types, is it the same for different data types? Is the field properties the same for different data type? Yes or no?
No, sir.
No, it's not the same. And even if it's the same data type, is it the same field properties you're getting when you're using the same data type? Two fields are using the same data type, for example, first name and last name. They're using short text. Is the field properties the same now that we're using the same data type? Jeremy says yes, Emmanuel says no. Well, I guess it depends on how you take my question. So the first question was, when we have different data type, is the field properties the same? No, it's not the same. So you can clearly see the field properties changing between the two here. So each data type has different field properties, has different settings, you can see. Now, the same data type, for example, short text, is going to have the same settings. It's going to have the same field properties, but it is only linked to that field name. That setting is only linked to that field name. So we talked about it last week. For example, last name, we could set the field size to 255, and first name, we could set that to 8 characters. So for the same data type, the settings, the list of settings are going to be the same, but the settings are linked to the individual data type. Each field name has its own settings basically. So what are some of those settings? What are some of those field property options that we have? So this table here describes quite a few of them. So we're going to go through this table here. So firstly, we have field size. We already went through this one. So it limits a text field to a specific number of characters or a number field to the range of numbers it can store. So it limits the field to how much data you want to have inside of it. So if you say 10, that means only 10 characters can be entered inside. Next, we have the format data type. It controls the way data appears in the datasheet view. So format is equivalent to your format in your spreadsheet. So just like in spreadsheet where you could have changed the format of your data, where you enter 5 and you can go to the format box here and you can say put it as a number or put it as a date. That is format. So for example, we're going to use age, the number age, data type. At the bottom in the field properties, notice we have format, and I'm going to go to the arrow at the very end, and notice we have different formats here. So I can say that should be a currency. So age is now a currency. So once again, I'm going to save, because remember you have to save before you exit, and then I'm going to switch a view. So notice age has currency underneath it now. So that is the purpose of format when you want to change the view of your data. Then we have decimal places. We can set basically how many decimal places we want. So let's see how we do that. Go back into design view, and right below format, notice we have decimal place. So it's set to auto. So once again, we're going to go straight across to the arrow on the right, and we see how many decimal places we want. I want 5 decimal place. I'm going to save, switch over back to datasheet view, and notice my age is now a currency data type with a 5 decimal places. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
Right. Now we have input mass. Now what is input mass? Input mass sets a pattern that determines the input format of data, such as hyphens in a telephone number, for example, this here. So it sets a pattern of data. Now let me test it out to see how I can set that input mass. I think it's we can do xxx hyphen x. Let me see if that's gonna work. I'll need to change the field size. Okay, I think that's gonna work there. I'm gonna set the field size to 15. See if that works. Okay, I think we gotta put numbers. Okay, it's not allowing me to edit it. Give me a second, let me check to see how I'm supposed to use input mass. So, what is the pattern? 0. So let me try 0. So 0, 0, 0, item 0, 0, 0. For example, 0. Alright, let me try that now. Save. Let me delete this field size. Save again. The setting entered isn't valid for these properties. Oh, is it because it's short text? Alright. No. It has to be short text. I'll just leave it. Alright, I'll get back to you guys on that one when I figure out how to use it. But that's the idea there though, that you set a pattern for the data, and when persons enter the data now, it is going to follow that pattern. They would see the pattern of data and they would enter in the data to match it. Now next we have caption. Caption specifies a label other than the field name that can appear in the table and on forms and reports. So it's like how in spreadsheets, we could, this cell here has a name, cell F4, and we could give it another name, say for example cat. So now it has both name, it has both the name of F4 and cat. So similarly, our field name phone, we could give it another name. So if you notice right below input mass, there's a caption. So we can type in something else, cell phone. So it's gonna have that name taken over the field name now. So you could have the field name as phone, and then you could have a caption, cell phone. So if we save this here and go back to our datasheet view, notice we have cell phone at the top here. I think one of the benefits of using this caption is that we can use space. I think that's one of the benefits, that we can use space, that because it's not the actual field name and it's just something that is like covering or replacing it, in that case we could use space when we want to have something that has a name with space. But that's what the caption does. It replaces the actual field name with another name. Next we have default value. It displays a specified value for a field in new records. So let's look at that there, default value. A value that's automatically entered in this field for new items. I think that's going to start off with, let's see if that's going to start off with T. Yeah, so every time we have an entry, it's going to start off with that letter T. So for example, if we want to do a phone number, for example, that same phone number there, we could say that how it's going to start off with 592 inside of it. So when we go to here, so it starts off with 592, and we could enter in our rest of the number. So we have to enter in 592. The value entered isn't appropriate for the input mask. Okay, let me try back input mask stuff because I'm thinking I'm getting an idea now. Alright. So change the input mask. So that. So okay, that worked. That's not how it's supposed to work. But that's the default value there that you saw, that we can enter a default value and that will appear whenever a new field you have to enter data. Next we have validation rule. So validation rule limits the data entered to meet a certain requirement. For example, you can specify that the customer ID cannot be less than 1,000. So let me delete the input mask and let me delete that. So I'm going to use this on age number. So validation rule, we can say it should be greater than 999. That is 9,999. So the next value, you could only enter basically 5 digits. It has to go from 10,000 and above. So where's age? Where's the age that I entered? Yeah. Okay. So notice I cannot save this 44433 because one or more values are prohibited by the validation rule greater than 9999 set for this table. Enter a value that the expression for this field can accept. So it won't accept anything below 9,999. So even if I add 8,043, 43 still won't work. I would need to go beyond 10,000 and it's going to accept that data there. So same with these below. If I enter there, why did it accept it? Okay, now it's not working. And then, so any new value now, it's not going to work. So it always has to go beyond that 10,000. So that's the purpose there of validation rule. So when you want a certain specific amount of number, this is what I was talking about in the last class, these two can work together, validation rule and field size. So field size is going to set the upper limit. Field size is going to be this size here. So this one is going to say that the maximum character is going to be 15. But there's nothing stopping the person from entering less than 15 characters. That is where your validation rule can come into play. Your validation rule now is going to be on the other side. And this here could say that how it should be starting at 10 characters. So you get persons to enter within that range of 10 to 15 characters using a combination of validation rule and field size. Are you guys following?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now next we have validation text. Now validation text is just a text that appears when you get this error message for the validation rule. So let's go back to our data sheet. Let me escape. Okay, one thing to note, and please remember this, that if you notice, when I enter this data here, I'm going to constantly get this error message. Now, unlike spreadsheet where you can just click out of somewhere and it clears that cell or it clears off the error, it's not like that for database. You could click anywhere and you're still going to constantly get this error message. Notice that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to click out of the cell, but it's not allowing me. In that case, you have to press the escape key. And that is how you'll be able to continue to working on anything. So escape is the key that you'd have to press there. Now we're going to go back to our design view and we're looking at validation text. So notice at the very bottom we have validation rule and validation text right underneath it. So you could enter a message. You could say something like your input is not greater than 9,999. Please enter 10,000 and above. So we're going to save that. Go back to our data sheet and we're going to enter 7,000. Notice our error message here. The same error message that we put for the input, the validation text. Your input is not greater than 9,999. Please enter 10,000 and above. So when you want persons to be clear as to what's the error that they're getting, what they're doing wrong, that is where the validation text can come into play. Now we have required. This specifies a field cannot be left empty when you enter data into a record. So if you notice, we have some empty fields here. We have a lot of empty fields here. So if you set it to required from no to yes, then those fields cannot remain empty. So it all depends on your situation. What are you creating the database for? Do you have to collect all of that data? Then yes, you're going to make it required. But for you guys, I don't think you should turn that on because you're going to run into some errors, especially when you miss out those fields. It's going to constantly nag at you to enter data. And then you might get frustrated that you have to enter those data and it's constantly nagging you about it. Which did I set? Let me set last name. So last name required. Yes. Okay, I'm not seeing. I guess because there's no. That is written in the record. Okay, good. See, we're getting the message here. You must enter a value in last name. So we can't go past this row until we enter a some sort of data into last name. So once again, I have to press the escape key in order to come out of that cell so that I can take off this setting here and continue. There. So next we have allow zero length. This determines whether or not you can enter quotation marks in a field to indicate that there is no data for that field in the record. So remember, we just have required. So if you're required to enter data, then obviously you must enter data. So these two are going to work alongside each other, so that if there's some reason you set it to required, but you don't have the data to put it in, or there is no data to put in, you can allow zero length, whereby you put in quotation marks so that it will accept it as input. So that's automatically on there. So let me test it out to see if it actually works. So I'm going to set this back to yes. And I'm going to go to the bottom here, type in here. So notice I cannot go beyond until I enter something into last name. So I'm going to enter, is it double quotation? Yeah. Double quotation, enter. This here has to go beyond 10,000. So much rules. Okay. So notice we went into the new row now. We're now inside of the new row, and because we entered that double quotation mark here. And then lastly, we have index. Index speeds up retrieval of data in a field. All primary key fields are automatically indexed. So it's just a technique of it's not on by default, it's off by default. So it's just a way of organizing your data quickly so that you can retrieve the data if needed. So those are some of your field properties, settings, options that you're gonna find inside of your database. So make use of them when you are creating your database, but ensure you do not ensure you know what you're doing before you get started. Plan before you actually do something, because if you notice, if you do something wrong, you end up trapping yourself, basically, you can say, and you can cause a lot of headache for yourself when you put in data. Now, I don't know if you guys notice, but you don't get a new row unless you complete. Sometimes plans don't work out. Yes, sometimes your plans don't work out. So if you guys notice, you do not get a new row unless you enter data in the row before. So notice I'm in this row here. So unless I enter data into this row, I won't get a new row. So why that is the case, you have to understand what is the purpose of a database. The purpose of the database is to store data. It's not just for you to open like how we have spreadsheet and for you to enter data wherever and whenever you feel like. No, databases must be organized, it must be structured. So you must enter an entire row of data. You must enter an entire row of data before you go on to another row. So you must complete basically an entire record before you go on to another record. So that is why we have so much rules that we can set. That's why we have so much options we can set. The validation rule, the default value, the input mask, because we want when the data is being entered to be correct. That's why we have so much settings, so that we are guaranteed when this person is entering data, the system is going to prevent them from entering the wrong type of data into the wrong location. So are you guys following as to why we have so much field property settings?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Great. So it's all to ensure that database is accurate at all times, because remember, you're entering data and you must ensure your data is accurate. Yes, it's a lot to remember. Actually, half of these you might not even be using. The one that you should focus on the most is your field size, your format. You'll definitely use format and decimal places the most because you're gonna want to change how your data is being presented and how much decimal places you want. You won't use caption that much. Um, you're gonna only use validation text unless you're using validation rule. You might not even use these ones at the bottom here. It's just field size, format, and decimal place. And for those persons who want to ensure that the right data would go in, they would use input mass, default value, validation rule, and validation text. Eventually you'll get used to it, don't worry. Alright, so if we look back at our table once again, so this is going to be, my number is not working. Why is the number not working? I copied it over as number. Give me a second, let me sort this out. Look at this one. Let's do that one. So set field size and other field property options. So we create our database file, we create our tables, we design by giving it a name, create our field name, setting our data type, setting our description, and then we set whatever field properties that we need. So we just covered all of those field properties. We would set whichever ones we would need to ensure data is entered accurately. Now, we're going to finish off the chapter with primary key. Now, this is going to be somewhat technical, but it's actually simple. Now, let's see. Let me give you guys an example. So when you guys are creating a table, so you're creating a table, and you would normally, why can I not draw straight line? You would normally put in the information, first name, last name, age, whatever the case may be. So you're going to put in information, first name, last name, age. This is another person's information. This is another person's information here. So we have 3-person information so far. Now, there's a reason why I left this first column empty. In this first column here, what would you normally put into this first column? If you guys were creating this table, what do you normally put into this first column? There's something specific you regularly put there. Don't you guys number? Exactly, you number. So you normally put number sign at the top there, and you would number them. You would say this is the first student, this is the second student, this is the third student. Why are you doing this here?
Sir, to like keep track of which part you at?
Good. Robert? To keep track of the amount. Good. So keep track of how much persons are in the table. You would keep track of how much persons in the table. You would ensure that that the person name isn't repeating. That's why you would number it. You would ensure that you have the right amount of persons on the table, because when you number it, you know exactly how much is on the table. It helps in so many different ways. Now, it can also be used to identify that person, because you would remember that at number one, say for example, Sharmani's name was here at number one. Now at number four, say you see Sharmani's name here already. Then you're going to remember that at number one, you saw her name. So you're going to scratch that out. It's already there at number one, and you put somebody else's name. So the numbers also help you to link it to other person, link it to the information. Now, if you notice, as we've been learning so far for database, a row is called a record. So in this table here also, this information that is going across is also called a record. So just like in your database, just like in this table here, in your database, you need a way to identify each record to make it less confusing, to allow you to identify that record, to know how much records you have also. So you would number each record basically so that you can identify it. Because the information is already at number one, you don't want to have it repeated. So just like how you would number a table so that you can uniquely identify each record, so that you don't have it repeating, nobody don't accidentally put the same name, they don't put the same information multiple times in the table. Similarly, in database, we have a mechanism for that, to ensure that each record is unique, that nobody can go and put in the same information again. Now, that is called a primary key. A primary key is our method in database to uniquely identify a record. So instead of trying to remember what is all of the information in the record, say for instance, there is more columns and headings and information and so on. Instead of trying to remember all of the information inside of it, you can tell a person, go to number one, and you can see all the information for Sharmani. Go to number three, and you're going to see all the information for Jada. So that is similar to how we use primary keys in database. We have a, say for example, an ID number. And that ID number, say for example, 001, we can say that ID number represents Jada's information. So when you say you want to see Jada's information, we would normally say go to ID 001. And that ID represents her row of information, her record. So when you find that record now with that ID, you know it is her information. So that there is called the primary key. So if we go back to our table, now after you would have created your set your field properties, you are going to create a primary key. So you've set your field properties, you set your data type, create your field names. After you finish with all that, you are going to create a primary key. So let's go into the paragraph now. Let's see. I think it's I can't remember where we stopped off. Right. We're gonna start from Tasani. Tasani, are you there? Timothy? No, Timothy. Suresh? Three in a row. Amelie, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Alright, can you read the two paragraph for us?
Primary key, sir.
Yes.
Usually one particular field of each record contains an item which is used to identify the record. This field is called the primary key field. This value in the key field must uniquely identify each record. Using the bookshop example, the CID field in a customer table can be used to uniquely identify each customer. You would not use first or last field names, as more than one person may have those names.
Continue.
The need for a key field becomes clear when you think of what might happen if you wanted to search a database for John Smith. Smith is a common surname, and you might find that there are lots of Smiths in your database, and more than one John. It is better, therefore, to have a unique reference, such as an identification number, key field, on which to search.
Great, thank you. So, what is a primary key? Well, as I mentioned already, it is a unique field. Remember, we already learned what is a field. A field is one piece of data. So a primary key is a unique field that is going to represent that record, that is going to be used to identify that record. So if you look at this example of the customer table has a field called CID. And if you look at CID, all of the CID is unique. So it uniquely represents the record. So for example, 1122 represents the information for John Rich. 1138 represents the information of Ed Yard. So that field uniquely represents that record. So that's what we call a primary key. Now, why do we need a primary key? Well, we just read in the example that our database is going to have a lot of data. That's the first thing you need to imagine. Your database has a lot of data. And say, for example, your database is about storing students' name. What do you mean if I'm okay? Are you guys hearing me clearly?
I'm hearing you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So the audio just messed up.
Okay. Yeah, I think I heard my computer revved up a bit. Maybe that's why. Good. So I was saying, why do we need a primary key? Why can't we just search for if our database is about person's name? person's personal information, students' personal information. Why can't we just search for somebody's first name? Why can't we just search for their last name? Why can't we just search for their date of birth? Well, persons have the same first name. Persons have the same last name. In third farm, if I think there's about 5 persons with the last name Singh. So if you search for that last name, you're gonna get how much ever persons with that same last name, much less first names and so on. So it's not effective to search for information that can repeat, especially if you're just looking for one person. So imagine if it was a hospital. Remember, that's going to have a lot of data inside of it. And if you just search for Singh for the last name, the amount of Singhs that might appear, it will not be beneficial to search through all of that. You're going to have to search through all the Singhs just to find your information. Now, what if there was a way for you to uniquely identify each Singh? That there is the purpose of your primary key. Your primary key now can uniquely identify each person, whether all of them has the same last name, same first name, same date of birth, whatever the case may be. So just like how seems Monique know the song. So just like how this customer table here has first name and last name, and we can give each customer a unique ID. Similarly, that hospital can give each patient a unique ID. So when you want to identify that patient now, you can say patient with the ID 11537. That is the patient I am looking for. And when they search for that ID now, they can find exactly who they want. Are you guys following as to what's the purpose of a primary key?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, how do we set that primary key in our database? How do we create that primary key? It's very simple. First, you have to create a field that is going to be unique. If you guys remember, that is actually one of the reasons why we have the Autonumber data type. So you can actually create a field. I'm going to go over to another table. So you can actually create a field. So we can say this field is going to be CID field. And how do we make the CID field the primary key? Well, if you notice at the very top here, there's a primary key option. So you just simply click on it, and if you notice, a key appeared here. That key is indicating this field is the primary key. If we go back to the other table, notice the ID field has a key beside it, indicating it is the primary key. So that is how you create the primary key. If you don't want it to be the primary key anymore, you simply take it off. It's that simple to make a field a primary key or to take it off. So we're going to make CID the primary key, and we can actually create our own primary key. We can say 001, 002, 003, 004. So we are creating our own primary key here. But if you notice, I have to type it in all the time, and I have to remember what is it. But if I type in 004, notice I'm going to get an error. So you don't have to worry about using back the same value, because the system would not even allow you to use back the same value, because that field is a primary key and the system knows it must be unique. Notice the message. The changes you requested to the table were not successful because they would create duplicate values in the index or primary key or relationship. change the data in the field or fields that contain duplicate data, remove the index, or redefine the index to permit duplicate entries and try again. So, primary keys, that's also important to remember, they do not allow duplicate values because that's what we are trying to avoid in the first place. We want a unique value to identify each person. So, it will not allow duplicate values. So we just looked at creating our own primary key, but we can also let the system create its own primary key. So for example, that is where the Autonumber data type can come into play. So I'm just going to create a random field here. And notice when I go to data sheet view, every time I enter age, notice a number appears. Notice a new number, and it's always going to be unique. It appears all the time. So that there is if you want to create a quick primary key field, that is what the Autonumber is for. It's not only just to count, it's also there to create a quick primary key. But there's some cases where you might want to create your own primary key. So that is where you can set it to a normal data type, a text data type, and you type in what information you want as the primary key. Are you guys following?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right, let's wrap up this rest of information here, and then we're going to close off here. So Amina, could you read the rest of information for us?
Other unique keys. A candidate key can also be a primary key if it is unique. However, only one field must be chosen as a primary key. Candidate keys are entirely optional, so a table may contain none, one, or several of them. A composite key is a primary key that made up of two or more fields. In the bookshop database, CID cannot be a primary key in the order table, as there are multiple occurrences of 1128 and 1167 in that column. Also, PID cannot be a primary key in the order table either because P3 430 and P3 639 are also listed more than once. Therefore, figure 8.5 shows a composite key using two fields CID and PID. This is done so that the customer can order more than one product and more than one customer can order the same product. In a database where the same field is found in two or more tables, if it is a primary key in one table, then it is a foreign key in other tables.
Great, very good. So we have 4 keys that you guys need to remember. We have 1 primary key, and notice we have other keys. So we have 2 candidate key, 3 a composite key, and 4 a foreign key. Now I want you guys to take note that the primary key is the main key. Every table that you create, notice our steps to create a database. Every table that you create, every table that you create must have a primary key inside of it. It must have a primary key. So if you create 3 tables, that means you have 3 primary key, 1 for each table. So primary key is the main key. That's the one you're going to be using all the time. Now, these here are basically keys that come about because of certain situations. So, what is a candidate key now? Now, Now a candidate key and a foreign key, you do not create them. They are basically something that they're basically, what do I call them? Terms. So candidate and foreign, you do not create. Whereas the primary key and the composite key, those two you can create in your database. So candidate and foreign, they're just names for the keys depending on the situation. Whereas only primary and composite are the ones you are going to create. So I already showed you guys how to create a primary key. So in any table, you must have a primary key. Now, what is a candidate key? As I mentioned, it's something you do not create, but it's basically a term that refers to a field that can be called a primary key. For example, we have a table, and we're gonna have ID, and we're gonna have first name, and we're gonna have last name, and we're gonna have passport number. Now, the ID number for each person, is that unique? Is the ID number for each person unique? Yeah. So when you guys are gonna get your ID card, we're talking about ID cards. The number that is on it, your ID number, that is unique. So that is gonna be used as your primary key because it is unique. Now, your passport number, is that unique also? Or you and another person got the same passport number?
No, sir.
It's unique. So the passport number can also be used as a primary key, but it is not being used as a primary key. We're already using ID number as the primary key. So in that case, your passport number is a candidate key. It has the possibility, the probability of becoming a primary key. So if, for instance, ID, something went wrong with it, passport number can take over. It can work as a primary key. So it's a candidate. So it's like if they're running for presidency, and it's a candidate to becoming the president, but it is not the president as yet, that is a candidate key. It can become a primary key, but it is not a primary key. You guys get the idea?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So a candidate key is basically any field that can become a primary key. Now, we have a composite key, and a composite key is basically when you join two fields together. When you join two fields together and make it into one key field, that is called a composite key. So for example, this table here, this table here, this database here. Now customer ID is supposed to represent each customer. PRID is representing each product. But if you notice in the order table on the right hand side here, we have the customers repeated multiple times. We have this customer here repeated multiple times. We have P3639 repeated multiple times. And remember, your primary key must be unique. So we cannot use CID by itself in this table, nor can we use PRID by itself, because they have fields repeating in both of their columns. So you cannot use them individually. So what you can do now is combine the two together. Combine the two fields together and make a completely unique number. And that is called a composite key. So how do we create a composite key now in your database? So I'm going to use CID, customer ID, and passport ID. So how do we make these two a composite? Well, you need to highlight two of them. How do we highlight it? Well, outside in this gray box here, you click on the first field, you hold Control, just like in spreadsheet, and you click on the other field. So that way you highlight both of them. And then you simply click on the same primary key option at the top here, and notice both of them now have a key at the side of them. So that there, these two fields are now a composite field, thus making them a primary key. So a composite key is a primary key, but just that, it is made up of two fields. And then lastly, what is a foreign key? A foreign key is basically a term once again. Say we have another table. I'm going to divide this screen. Say this red line represents we have two different tables. So in this table, once again, we have ID. And we have first name and we have last name. And we have another table over here. And this table has the passport ID as the primary key, but it also has the ID number inside of it and other information. Now over here, ID is going to be used as a primary key. Now, because ID is a primary key in this table here, and it is being used in another table, when it is being used in another table, it is called foreign. It is called a foreign key. So if a field is a primary key in one table, like for example this table on the left hand side, when that field is used in another table, it is called a foreign key. Are you guys clear on that?
Yes, sir.
So, as I mentioned already, the candidate and the foreign, you do not create it. They're just terms. So, a candidate is something that can become a primary key, and foreign represents a primary key in another table. Composite and primary key are the ones that you create. So, these questions here, please do them for your homework for next week. We're going to review all of these questions here next week so that we can see if we have a complete understanding of this entire chapter here. Please take your time doing it, and please start this exercise. Work together in groups. If you don't have Microsoft access, work together in groups so that you can help out those that do not have a computer and unfortunately has a Chromebook. So in review of what we looked at today, or in review for the chapter, we looked at the order that we create a database, the structural layout. We looked at some terms, we looked at how to create our table, how to design our table, how to set our field names, our data types, the different field properties. And then we finally look at how to create our primary key. What's the purpose of the primary key? To uniquely identify each record. I'm going to review primary key next week, so don't worry if you didn't get it or understand it now. But the main point to remember, each table must have a primary key. And when you cannot create a single field as a primary key, that is when you can combine two fields and make it a composite key. And candidate and foreign, they're just terms that we do not create. They're keys that we do not create. So complete the questions as homework. Complete the exercises as practice also. Do you guys have any questions before we end?
No, sir.
Alright. So if you guys don't have any questions, we're ending here for today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, sir. Have a good break. Bye-bye.